I get a lot of questions about my home coffee setup. Today I'd like to welcome you into my house. I'm going to show you all my brew equipment, brew some coffee together, and go over the equipment I use and why. Let me introduce you to my gear. I've got my unpronounceable scale, Akayo, or whatever. I've got one of the prizes of my collection. This is my hand grinder. Beautiful little burr grinder that I actually picked up when I was traveling in Thailand in 2013. The brew method today, we have our V60, which is the cone at the top here, pour kettle, paper filters, and an old cleaned up peanut butter jar that I use as my humble brew vessel. Why all this gear, Serge? Why are we going through so many steps when I can push a button on my Keurig or something like that? And I love the ritual. I love going through the steps. I love treating coffee like a scientific experiment. We're going to control as many variables. We're going to control the amount of coffee. We're going to control the grind setting. We're going to control the water weight, the temperature, and everything. And then when we have multiple coffees, when we taste them side by side, and if those coffees taste different, we'll know that the coffee is what's different, not how we prepared it. So let's dive into this. Let's make some coffee. So some of you might not be familiar with what a V60 is. It's a very straightforward brew method. It's basically just a cone. They come in ceramic, they come in metal, sometimes in plastic. And the whole goal is to put the coffee in and pour water over it. This is actually the same thing you'll find inside of most like basket brewers. And I like it just because the amount of control it offers. I get to sit here, I can watch it, I'm touching the coffee, I'm really invested in part of the brew method. Quite a bit of thought can go into which brew method you use. There's a lot of different brew methods. You've heard of espresso, French press, pour over, Chemex, AeroPress. There's all these different words and what do they mean? Now, each coffee has a range of flavors that it can offer. It has very heavy base notes, very light notes, sometimes tea-like, sometimes fruity and stuff like that. And what a different brew method is going to do is it's going to highlight a chunk of what that coffee has to offer. A French press will bring out really heavy base notes, same with espresso. Something like a Japanese coffee siphon or an AeroPress might really highlight those higher notes, those lighter notes. I love the V60 because it does a great job of right in the middle, showing a nice average, a really nice introduction to what that coffee has to offer. Let's weigh the coffee. An important thing whenever you're brewing is to figure out what your brew ratio is, the ratio of coffee to water. A great starter amount is about 16 grams of water for every 1 gram of coffee you use. I like something a little bit stronger. So today I'm going to use 32 grams of coffee and 510 grams of water. Perfect. Very important thing for your scale, make sure it goes to 1/10 of a gram. It gives you just that much more control. Now that we've weighed our coffee, it's time to grind our coffee. But how do I know how coarse or how fine to grind it? Well, the V60 sits right in the middle, so we're gonna do the same thing with our grind setting. Not too coarse, not too fine, just nice and happy in the middle. In this whole process, grinding the coffee is definitely the single longest individual step, and I realize that's not for everybody, but I love the ritual. I love going through this. I love the sound, the feel, the smell. I mean, the first time the beans hit the burrs, it opens up, you can smell it, and I love it. Now, something you shouldn't be afraid to do is just get right in there and touch your coffee. And you can feel if the grind setting is right. Not too coarse, not too fine. Love it. Now that the coffee is ground, let's get our brew vessel ready. An important step here is actually to preheat all of the gear we're going to use. We don't want cold brew equipment because then when we add hot water, we end up with lukewarm coffee. Not only are we going to preheat the V60 and the peanut butter jar, we're also going to preheat the pour kettle, and we're going to rinse the paper filters to get rid of any dust and to get rid of sort of that like papery flavor. We've wet our filter. Now, how do you know when this has been preheated? Just put your hand on the side. You can feel when the chill is gone and when the heat comes through, that's good enough. The technique when adding water to a V60 is fairly straightforward, but you gotta be a little bit careful because water is lazy. Water is always going to try and follow the path of least resistance, which means if you pour too close to the side, instead of the water passing through the coffee and extracting, it's going to hide, it's going to run past it all, and it's not going to taste very good. So when we're adding water, we're going to be careful. We're going to aim for the center. We're going to do very little circles. The second thing we're going to try and do is try not to add water too quickly. What's going to happen there is the coffee will float up. And then as the water level drops, coffee will be trapped up top. It'll be called high and dry, left high and dry, and that's not desirable. The third thing we're going to do is we're going to watch out for something called channeling. Channeling is what happens when gas bubbles form a little path that the water can go through, and you'll tell it's there if you see lots of bubbles coming out. One thing we want to be careful of is not too much agitation. Agitation is when you get in there and you physically like touch the coffee. And not that that's bad, but that's harder to replicate. And if what we're trying to do is be very deliberate, very scientific, very repeatable, that's something that's harder to replicate. So if we see bubbles coming through, we'll go in with a spoon and we'll give it just a very light touch to break up that channeling. So again, we get a nice, even extraction. I'm going to add our coffee now. We want to double check our coffee weight. And we went 32 in, and now we only have 31.8. So somewhere along the lines, we lost some coffee. Let's just really quickly fix this. I have no idea how we lost coffee, but here we are. One of the most important parts of the pour over is the first little bit of water we add. This process is called the bloom, and you'll see as the water hits it, the coffee rises up as all the oils and the gases open up for the first time. So we want to add about 70 to 100 grams of water and just sit and watch the bloom, even smell it. It's a very fun part of the pour over. You can see a little bit of bubbling sometimes. That's okay, especially during the bloom. That'll happen. If we get a lot of bubbling is when we'll start adding some agitation. How do you know when the bloom is done? Well, that'll happen either you will see the coffee kind of cave in itself, or the water will stop dripping, whichever happens first. It stopped dripping and let's go. So again, the focus is into the center, very small circles, making sure that we don't get too close to the edge, and making sure that we don't add water too quickly. And keeping our eyes open for any potential channeling. The very end here, I'm going to add a little bit of extra water. And then I'm going to give a bit of a swirl. This again is controlled agitation. The swirl is to try and prevent high and dry. And the shape I'm going to be looking for in the coffee is a little dome, or at least very flat, even stuff here. And now we watch. Nice.